Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today for another chapter of the Seth material. Today is February 19th, 2024. And today we're going to do chapter 7. And here we go. Chapter 7, Out-of-Body Episodes. I popped into a taxi while my body stays at home. We started the in-stream tests and our own envelope tests in August of 1965. In October, my first book was coming out, and Peg Gallagher, a reporter from the Elmira Star-Gazette, interviewed me. I'd known her slightly in the past, but now she and her husband and Rob and I became good friends. Bill is assistant advertising director of the Star-Gazette, and he and Peg were soon leaving for a vacation in Puerto Rico. We decided to set up an experiment. We wouldn't communicate at all through usual means. Instead, we would ask Seth if he could, quote, tune in on the Gallaghers during their vacation. During their trip, we would substitute this experiment for our envelope tests. We knew that Peg and Bill were going to San Juan, but that was all we knew. Besides, neither Rob nor I have ever been to Puerto Rico. We were in the middle of a Seth session, and Seth was giving his impressions of the Gallagher's trip. As I sat in my favorite rocker, speaking to Seth, suddenly I found myself in the back seat of a cab. The next instant, the cab took such a sharp turn to the right that I was shoved over into the corner of the seat. For a minute, I was really frightened. I wasn't used to being comfortably seated in the living room one minute and in the back seat of a swiftly moving cab the next. I had just enough time to see the cab driver's neck from the rear. It was thick and stubby. I didn't see his face. While this was going on, I lost all contact with my body in the living room. My subjective sensations were those of someone suddenly thrown off balance by the sickening swerve of the car's turn. Yet while this was happening, my physical body sat upright in the rocker, speaking without pause, as Seth. A cab ride. Our cat lover laughs. Seth's nickname for Peg, who dislikes cats. A $3 fare, which seems too much. An old rather than young cab driver with a stubby neck. A destination that is mainly to the right after one turn. When Peg and Bill returned, we found out that these impressions were quite legitimate. They had paid a $3 cab fare to go to the motel from the airport. Peg was quite angry about this, since the same ride 2 years earlier had cost less than $2. Their cab took a very sharp turn to the right. Peg and Bill remembered this vividly, not only because of the sudden turn, but also because this happened right after the driver had run through a traffic light. The turn had been so sharp that it had upset them considerably. But the cab driver was not, quote, old rather than young. Interestingly enough, Peg said, he did look old from the rear, though, because his neck had a peculiar rough, mottled look. It was also thick and stubby. I was really delighted when the whole thing checked out. I saw just what I could have been expected to see had I been in the cab physically. Peg and Bill were never aware of my presence. The incident had several intriguing implications. I was definitely the one who was, quote, out. Yet Seth described what I saw. His voice and personality were in control of my physical system, while my consciousness was someplace else and a good many miles away. I didn't have to tell Seth what happened. He described it immediately. He didn't mention my senses when I was thrown into the corner of the cab, though. Was this because he didn't feel them, or because I was certain to remember these myself? And consider this puzzler. Granted, my consciousness traveled from Elmira to San Juan in space. What about time? The session was held on Monday, October 25th, 1965. But the incident happened to the Gallaghers 1 week earlier, on Monday, October 17th. Yet I lived that experience just as vividly as though it transpired at that moment in Puerto Rico. Seth also gave other correct impressions of the same trip. The next episode didn't involve Seth directly, except that I was following his directions in the use of the inner senses. I decided to see what impressions of the Gallagher trip I could get on my own. So one morning that same week, I lay down, closed my eyes, and gave myself the suggestion that I would find Peg and Bill. Suddenly, without transition, I found myself descending through the air to land on a long, narrow porch that was surrounded by a low railing. I knew that my body was in bed, but lost all contact with it. Regardless of where it was, I was someplace else entirely. Looking around, I saw that I stood on the veranda of an oddly constructed double-story motel. The building was raised up from the ground in a manner different from the usual. Over the railing, a small body of water was visible, and beyond this, there was a much larger body of water, an ocean, I thought. Was this Puerto Rico? I had no idea. Doors opened off the veranda, which extended the full length of the motel. I wondered if this was where the Gallaghers were staying. Instantly, I knew that it was, and that at the center door led to their room. Peg and Bill weren't in sight, though. Before beginning the experiment at 11 a.m., I had set the alarm clock for 11:30. Now it rang. My consciousness returned so quickly to my body that my physical head was swimming. I sat up in dismay. Couldn't I find out more? Couldn't I see a sign or get a more definite idea of the location? I didn't know if it would work or not, but I reset the alarm for 30 minutes later. And then I lay back down and told myself I would return to the same place. Brief but definite traveling sensations followed. Mountains and skies swept by. Then I found myself hovering in the air above the same motel. I was too high to make out the details, so I willed myself to move down closer. Without any difficulty, I changed position and came down, though still not to the ground. A man was directly beneath me and slightly ahead of me. He wore a business suit and hat and carried a briefcase. As I watched, he crossed the blacktop expanse to a sidewalk and entered a large building on the other side of the motel. I remember thinking it odd that he wore business clothes in what I took to be a resort area. It seemed that only moments had passed, but the alarm rang once again. I snapped back to my body. Talk about being excited. Immediately, I drew a diagram of the motel and surrounding areas. I couldn't wait for the Gallaghers to return, so I could check this and the Seth impressions. I asked Peg to draw a diagram of their motel and its nearby neighborhood. Peg's diagram matched mine. My description of the motel was correct, including the center door that led to their room. The motel was on St. Thomas, an island near Puerto Rico. Peg and Bill were there the day of my experiment, the following day. Not only that, but the man I saw was one Bill noticed on both mornings, specifically because he wore business clothes. The man was a native, another reason Bill noticed him. I didn't know this, having seen him from the rear. The building he'd entered had been the post office. I was fascinated. There was so much to learn. In the CAP episode in the Seth session, Seth had described everything while I saw it. This time I had to wait until I got back to my body to write down what had happened and draw my diagram. As far as I was concerned, I had enough evidence to convince me that both episodes were legitimate. They started me on my own work in out-of-body experiments, in which I am still trying to find answers to the many questions posed by such phenomena. Later, Seth was to give us instructions. As a matter of fact, as I write this book, Rob and I are just starting to a joint series of projection experiments that Seth initiated. These first instances greatly increased my confidence in Seth's abilities and my own. How much more fun this sort of thing was than the in-stream tests, which we were also conducting. Even our own envelope series was dry in comparison. We mailed copies of the Gallagher material to Dr. Instream. I was really excited about the whole thing and waited eagerly for his comments. I took it for granted that he wouldn't consider that we had any scientific evidence, but we did have the nearly identical sketches and the impressions were correct. He may not consider this scientific enough, I said to Rob, but he has to admit at the very least that clairvoyance occurred. We had 25 in-stream tests and 83 envelope tests between August 1965 and September 1966. Like most people with no background in psychic work, I expected things to be pure and simple. If Seth was what he said he was, then he should be able to look into time and space and closed envelopes as easily as you and I can see objects in a room. I didn't realize how much depended on the depth of my trance and on my willingness to give him freedom. I had to learn to, quote, block information that came through. I didn't realize either that little is known about normal perception, much less extrasensory perception, or that no medium is expected to be 100% correct. The impressions had to come through me, and as the old saying goes, to err is human. Yet Seth managed to use the test to demonstrate his own clairvoyance ability, further my education, and instruct us on the processes involved. He varied the depth of my trances during tests so that I could get the feel of various stages of consciousness, and also showed me how to let him use my own personal associations in order to get certain data. He used the test to demonstrate ESP, but more, he gave me constant practice in changing my subjective focus, explaining the whole thing as he went along. Usually no one was present at these sessions, but Rob and I hardly a scientific state of affairs. But with the envelope tests, we weren't trying to convince scientists or psychologists of anything. We were trying to see what we could and could not expect of the sessions. We wanted something we could check out for ourselves right away. I wanted to know how we were doing. Sometimes Rob prepared the envelopes just before a session, and sometimes way ahead of time. He used all kinds of things for test items, some that I had seen recently or in the past, and some that I had never seen. He might use a letter, for example, that had come to the day before, and which I had read, or a bill from several years back, or an item he picked up that I had never seen, or an envelope prepared by a friend, in which case the contents were unknown even to Rob. Pieces of paper Rob picked up in the streets, leaves, beer coasters, chunks of hair, photographs, sketches, bills, all were used at one time or another. Sometimes Rob chose items specifically because they had strong emotional charges connected with them. Other times he purposely used neutral objects. We wanted to see if Seth did better with certain kinds of targets than others. The items were enclosed in one sealed envelope between two layers of light-proof Bristol cardboard. And then the whole thing was placed in another envelope, which was also sealed. I never knew when we would have such a test, and I never saw the envelope before a session. Rob would hand an envelope to me in the middle of a session. I was always in trance, and usually my eyes were closed. In any case, the test item was enclosed within the two pieces of cardboard and two envelopes and was quite opaque. Sometimes I held the envelope to my forehead while delivering impressions. After the session, we checked our results. Specific examples will appear in the next chapter. Talk about a seesaw. When Seth did well on the tests, I felt light as a feather for days. When anything didn't check out to my satisfaction, I felt as though I weighed 450 pounds. I was gaining a pound an hour. I thought that anything less than a perfect performance cast doubts on Seth's independent nature. All in all, our own test proved invaluable, not only as a part of my training and as a means of increasing my self-confidence, but also in preparing me for some other out-of-body experiences that would take place during later Seth sessions. The tests and Seth's comments also gave us insights into the nature of inner perception that literally could not have been achieved in any other way. As Seth varied the trance depths, I became aware of two lines of consciousness, his and my own, and to understand at least to some degree when my own personal associations were an aid and when they were a detriment. In a very deep trance, the inner processes were hidden, even from the medium. With most mediums, the mechanics are so automatic that little can be learned about the inner psychological actions involved in such work. Seth maintained that our situation would work to our advantage in this respect. The idea that he would often differentiate between his impressions and any of mine that has slipped in, connect mine to their source in personal associations, and tell us whether or not they were legitimate. I am seldom so, quote, blacked out as to feel as if I were sleeping. Usually I know what is going on, although I may almost instantly forget what has happened. On occasion, Seth and I can take turns talking so that I can go in and out of trance in seconds. Sometimes it seems I merge with Seth, feeling his emotions and reactions completely rather than my own. In this case, the Jane self is far in the background, dozing but dimly conscious. Other times, though less seldom, I am in the foreground, and Seth advises me as to what to say. Our own test gave me a standard against which to measure my performance and Seth's, providing an immediate check of accuracy and teaching me to sharpen my subjective focus to go from general to the specific. All of this training was important as far as my reception of the Seth material itself was concerned. Seth has often spoken about the necessary distortions that might occur in any such communications, and he is most concerned that the material be as little contaminated by distortions as possible. He discusses this thoroughly in later sessions. I started the autumn of 1965 then with high hopes, particularly because of the 2 out-of-body episodes mentioned earlier in this chapter. I waited to hear what Dr. Instream had to say about them. I was sure he'd have to admit that they were encouraging, even if they didn't involve his own experiments with us. We'd already begun his series of tests and were sending the results to him each week. So far, we'd heard nothing from him about these, and I also looked forward to see how we were doing here. If they turned out even half as good as the out-of-body data, I thought, we'd still be getting off to a great start. In the meantime, I'd felt my gallery job and was writing full-time. I'd left my gallery job and was writing full-time. I also began angling with one of the best paying and most popular magazines in the country. The editor turned down story after story, assuring me each time that I was certain to sell him the next one. I lived by the mail, waiting for an acceptance from this editor or from a report from Dr. Instream, trying to prove the existence of telepathy and clairvoyance to a self-professed, quote, heart-nosed psychologist, sell fiction to one of the best magazines in the country, and conduct our own tests in the Seth sessions was rather a bit to take on in 1 year. As I discovered. End of chapter 7. Well, thank you for joining us again, and we will be back next week for another chapter of the Seth material. In the meantime, have a great week and stay dry out in the rain. It's raining in California. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.